Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. Although I've never been much of a superhero girl, I've always had a soft spot for Miles Morales. He's my favorite Spider-Man. I find him more interesting and likable than the various versions of Peter Parker. That feeling carries over to their respective games as well. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a great mini-sequel to Insomniac's 2018 Spider-Man effort, and Rick Lane's Spider-Man review opens a new tab, wrote that it's a mostly good port of a mostly good game. The bad news is that the port of Miles Morales PC is still only mostly good. The good news is that it's a far better game. Miles Morales is a leaner experience than his predecessor. There may be less to do, but almost all of it is in a way that benefits Miles and New York. Much has been cut, there are fewer side quests to distract, and the story is much shorter than its predecessor. This is a perfect opportunity for a tighter, more intense storyline, and Miles Morales delivers. The story begins with a brief summary that brings me up to date on where Miles is now. The narrative focuses on the teen's family life, especially after the death of his father in the previous game, and fulfilling his new Spidey duties while the OG takes a naughty winter holiday. Routine web-slinging leads Miles to serious confrontations between the Roxxon Corporation and the Underground, a high-tech crime gang led by the Tinkerer. A good portion of the various twists and turns are predictable on a superhero level. But the game does a great job of bringing its actors to life and giving these predictable moments an emotional charge that allows for some forgiveness. Going for Miles. A more compelling story is undoubtedly aided by the fact that Insomniac has somehow managed to make being Spider-Man feel even cooler than it did before. It may be a snowy recreation of Peter Parker's New York, but the developer has tweaked the near-perfect web-slinging to make it feel even more satisfying. This time around, I've more control over running along walls and steering around buildings. By default, I moved around with the controller, but I tried the keyboard and found that port developer Nixes did a surprisingly good job of implementing the inputs. It took me a little while to get used to it, but eventually it felt just as intuitive as using a DualSense. Fighting the bad guys is largely the same for both Spideys, but Miles gets a few key additions that set him apart. His Venom abilities mix up the combat a bit, allowing Miles to deal electric damage to his opponents. The punches feel massive and the nice, fast-paced camera work makes the fights feel more dynamic. On the whole, though, the moveset remains the same. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but those expecting drastic combat developments may be disappointed. There's still an overabundance of stealth missions that require Miles to balance on poles and beams while quietly spinning up enemies out of sight. These missions have never been my favorite, and I usually got tired of scanning each enemy over and over to see if they were suitable for a stealth takedown. Many times I gave up and jumped into the fray, finding it much more enjoyable to take down an entire group of underground gangsters with my Venom Smash. After Miles Morales jumped over from the PlayStation 5 to PC, the game is already a graphical treat. On the whole, the port looks just as great, if not better. I did have some aliasing issues, though, especially during cutscenes. In the few hours I spent in New York, there were also a few graphics bugs, such as textures not loading properly and Miles missing entirely during loading screens, leaving a stray, patchy web. I also had an absolute problem with image drops and crashes. My system didn't handle the ray tracing options very well, and even when I turned them off, I'd some annoying frame rate issues during combat and traversal. Also, the game crashed several times, which isn't a huge problem for gameplay thanks to the autosave feature. But having to restart the game several times in one night was a bit frustrating. On the positive side, there are plenty of graphical options to play around with. If I reduce the traffic density and disable ray tracing, I can play on high settings with relatively few problems, aside from the crashing problem. I still recommend playing Insomniac's first Spider-Man simply because it adds to the strength of that game's story. But for those who just want to run through wintry New York, whizzing past skyscrapers at breakneck speed and kicking bad guys' butts, Miles Morales is the only true Spider-Man. It's the hero's best adventure yet, and it won't take much time either.